does reading mean to me? Well, everything in a way. I think all of us get a great deal out of reading, and my reading journey began, I suppose you could say, quite early on. I wasn't the best reader at school. I was one of these kids who always had a kind of reading age which was actually a little bit younger than what I actually was. But I did enjoy reading very much as a child, and I particularly liked, because I was quite a slow reader, books with pictures in. So I used to like the first books that I sort of read on my own were things like the Asterix books, and things like Fungus the Bogeyman. You can tell the sort of generation that I come from. And it was always things that were funny and quirky and had a kind of craziness about them that I really liked as a young reader. And I think that sort of developed further when I came across books like Richmal Crompton's William books and things like that. And I brought along with me one book which I think is really, really important in my personal reading journey. And it's this one. And it's called Uncle the Elephant by J.P. Martin. And as you can see, Uncle the Elephant's a very kind of happy elephant with a big purple dressing gown on, leaping around the place, here drawn by Quentin Blake years and years and years ago. This is a new edition. And Uncle the Elephant is just a series of fantastic stories about this elephant who is rich. He's got a great big castle. He's got people like Goodman around who pour tea from kettles and drink it in their mouths. He's got a badger that carried everything around with him. And the only problem for Uncle the Elephant is that on the other side of the river, just the other side of where the moat of his castle is, there is a bunch of people who live in a place called Badford. And they're led by somebody called Beaver Hateman, who's a horrible beaver. And they have skewers and old fish. And then there's a creature in Badford called Jelly Tussle that's a kind of mobile jelly. And they're smelly and horrible. And the one thing that all these people really can't stand is Uncle, because of his purple dressing gown and the way that he generally is rather superior. And so these stories are, I thought at the time, hilarious, and I still do now. And I think it was J.P. Martin's Uncle books that have stayed with me, really, through my reading journey. I think that's a really interesting thing about reading, is that you pick some things up and discard them, and some things just stay with you forever. And you just keep doing this through the whole of your life. So Asterix and Obelix from France I've carried with me, and from somewhere around here, Uncle the Elephant has stuck with me too. And these are both books that I probably read when I was round about 10, that sort of age, just at the moment when your reading journey is beginning. And funnily enough, as a writer, it's the age that I'm really interested in producing work for, because in a kind of way, just as I said, these things stay with you, your mind kind of wants to go back there too. So there's something about 10-year-old me that I'm still talking about now. The story behind the story I want to talk about now is my latest story, which is a book called Submarine Spies and the Unspeakable Thing. As I mentioned just now, I've always been quite interested in funny, quirky takes on the world, thinking about the elephant, thinking about Asterix and so forth. And here in Wales, where most of my stories are set, I do the same thing. And this story comes from right now. It's just come out, and it's about some spies who live on a submarine. And they get into contact with this little girl here called Caitlin. And the story within the story here is that my daughter is actually called Caitlin. She's no longer about 10 years old, but she's definitely got she definitely had a red duffel coat, which is an important part of the story. Now, in this book, the reason why I kind of started to write it, because I think there is always a story within the story, is because I happen to be living in a place called Carmarthen. Some of you may even live there now. And it happened to be at the time quite recently when the place flooded. The river came up, almost touched the bridge that goes to West Wales, and there was about a good yard of water all over everything. And I used to run around Carmarthen along the riverbank, and I used to plough up and down this road, whether it was full of water or not. And the more times I did it, the more I began to realise that this might have been a little route that was used throughout history to smuggle material into Wales and people out of them. And I kept going around this place, and I kept thinking about this idea of smuggling and how important it's been in Wales for years and years and years, how kind of embedded the idea of smuggling is. And I thought about the coracle guys on that river there, because I used to run past the hut where the local coracle association still lives, and thought to myself, I wonder if these guys have ever got involved in any serious smuggling in deep, distant history. And then I thought, well, I wonder whether in the Middle Ages or the Roman times, people used to smuggle stuff here. And then I managed to make a little connection and thought to myself, wait a minute. I know that King Henry VII, who came to be the king of Britain, came through Wales by smuggling. And he created an army and beat Richard III. And then I thought to myself, wait a minute, the French, when Napoleon was in charge of most of Europe, were trying to invade the United Kingdom, and guess where they tried to land? Wales. We've always been, because we're perhaps on the back end of the United Kingdom, a place that has smugglers and people travelling around who maybe didn't ought to be doing so. And so the more I kept thinking about this idea, and the more I kept thinking about being 10 myself, and also thinking about my daughter Caitlin and what she was like when she was 10, I started to think about coming up with a little story that had somebody who was really rather like Caitlin, who used to live in a cafe, and how the cafe might become a little hub for the smugglers who come in and out of this town. Except I kept thinking, they can't be just smuggling kings and queens in. They got to be smuggling something really important in. And then I began to think about the politics of what's going on now. And I thought, what if the Russians were smuggling spies into Carmarthen? Because you could get them up the river, and the railway station is really close to the river. What happens if they were getting there and they were giving them tickets to go off on the train secretly to start finding out secrets? And what if Caitlin, my daughter, actually lived in a cafe in Carmarthen and became involved in these people? Because Caitlin was an interesting child and she was interested in interesting things. And I'm sure she'd have been interested in a bunch of spies who came for a cup of tea in her cafe. And that's where the idea came from. Two stories within a story. One is like personal. It's a story about my daughter, or inspired by my daughter. And the other is not personal. It's what's going on in the world. It's about trying to make sense of what's happening in the world today by thinking about what's happened before in the past. People often ask me, where do characters come from? Where do the ideas for characters come from? Well, I've just described how in this story, one of the inspirational characters, maybe the inspirational character, is actually my daughter, Caitlin. This story does not have Caitlin in it. It's a character inspired by her. And I think what happens with characters, what writers do with characters, is there may be some kind of germ of an idea and reality about who gives them the idea for a character. But very quickly, if the character is any good, they start to walk off and behave like they want to, and not like the inspiration, the original idea for the character suggested they should. So good characters rapidly develop a life and a hinterland and characteristics of their own. So although Katie with her red duffel coat was an inspiration for this story. This character now is no longer the same Caitlin as the one I knew when she was 10. This character lives in a cafe in a town and looks after a bunch of spies, and then this character develops accordingly. In terms of the other kind of characters that I create, I think, again, it's this combination of making observations of what's going on around one. So there's a character in that book about the spies, Submarine Spies and the Unspeakable Thing, really important character, called Chinchilla. And Chinchilla is based on just simply a guy that I met who I got talking to in the pub. And there was no particular reason why somebody like him should appear in the story, but as the story developed, I realised that some of the physical characteristics that he had were influencing the story. To me, he looked a bit like a chinchilla because he had a sticky out tooth, and that seemed to stick. And somehow that business of making observations, talking to people a lot, trying to understand what they're saying to you, listening a lot, begins to give you the material that you need to create interesting characters. So in the other stories that I've written, if you go back and think of a story like The Rugby Zombies, which is the first children's book that I wrote, that's set in a different world to the one that Katie lives in. It's still in Wales. It's in a place called Abergary. And the characters in that revolve around this guy called Arwel, who goes to school in Arwel's in Abergary Comprehensive School. And there you've got a kind of a raft of characters who are roughly the same age at Arwel and connect you up to families around in Abergary and then to the zombies that live in the forests outside. And there again, almost all of those characters and the places that they live, I can trace to actual places that I've been, actual people that I know, and actual things that have happened. But of course, in the story, all of this gets warped and changed so that what you end up with is a book that is comprised of entirely new, fresh characters that speak for themselves. So I think that anybody listening to this who's thinking, how do I make a character? It's a funny kind of cookery. You need to be observant, you need to listen, but you also need to let them go so that as you write, they establish themselves. And then before long, all you're doing when you're writing is just making notes of what everybody's doing. This story is called Submarine Spies and the Unspeakable Thing. And this is how it starts. The thing about animals, thought Caitlin, was that nobody loved them enough. People were nice to them most of the time, but she'd noticed in school that when anybody brought an animal in to stay, quite often, it died. Insects could come in over the weekend, but it wasn't unusual to find that on Monday, when they did circle time with Miss Williams, the first announcement would be that Milo's praying mantis had got out of his box, or that Catherine's ant farm had been accidentally hoovered. Mammals, rabbits, gerbils and mice, weren't allowed to stay in overnight in school, but they could go for sleepovers. Often it turned out that although everybody in the class liked cuddling the new mammals when they first arrived home, they soon lost interest. Lots of mammals escaped from their sleepover houses and were never seen again. Once, Caitlin had been allowed to look after Rhiannon Minton's chinchilla because the Mintons were going to Portugal for a holiday. It was only for a week, but Caitlin's mum and dad said they would never let it happen again. Caitlin stayed up all night watching over the chinchilla. She read that chinchillas didn't like change and that human beings can sense when they're unhappy. She'd been to the vets in Johnstown as well to ask how to prepare for a chinchilla. The vets in Johnstown was her favourite place. When Caitlin grew up, she wanted to be a vet. Everybody in the vets in Johnstown knew Caitlin. She was always popping in to see what was going on, and if anybody wanted a helping hand, she knew both vets, Dewi, the farm vet, and Hera, the pet vet. And she knew the nurses, Nadia and Ken, too. She helped them feed any animals they'd kept in overnight in the recovery room, and she always brought seeds for Big Nose, the old grey parrot they kept there to talk to the sick animals and stop them from getting bored. She knew most of the patients too. Plumer, the border collie, who had to take special pills for his nerves. Emmental, the tabby cat, who only ate cheese and had to collect vitamins. Eric, the felt French bulldog, with one ear missing. And she knew all the owners, Mrs. Evans with the three-legged greyhound, Mrs. Pittman with the rheumatic lurcher, Mr. Constantinou, his son Tom, and their snakes. Caitlin was always visiting the vets because she kept finding animals who needed help. When she went to ask about chinchillas, she already knew that they were endangered in the wild and that they come from South America, and that some people say that the last wild chinchilla that had lived in Bolivia was discovered on somebody's plate at dinner time. Typical, said Caitlin. That's how nice people really are to animals. The advice from Kev was clear. Chinchillas don't like to get wet. It makes their fur go manky. They expect things not too hot and not too cold. And they love to roll around in the dust to keep clean. So Caitlin stayed up all night to make sure that Rhiannon Minton's chinchilla didn't get wet, remained warm, and had plenty of dust to roll around in. When she took Santiago back to school, Caitlin had black rings around her eyes and she fell asleep during maths. She'd slept by the chinchilla cage for a whole week. The creative challenge, Submarine Spies and the Unspeakable Thing, finishes with Caitlin, who's around about 10 years old, in her cafe, surrounded by spies from all over the world. She's met someone called Olga, who's a brilliant Russian mathematician who's created a code that can actually bring the universe as we know it to a standstill. And Caitlin has hidden this secret in her sock. I can't tell you too much because I don't want to give you a spoiler of everything that happens in the book. But I can tell you this. The secret to the universe is stuffed in Caitlin's sock. British spies are there. Russian spies are there. There's people from all over Wales. It's Christmas time. And the secret to how the universe is held together is in Caitlin's sock. I want to know what you think is going to happen next.